We want our relationships to be happy and healthy and to last. So, what's our part in making this happen? Today, I'm going to offer you 7 tips for being a good partner. Hey everyone, I'm Sonia, and on this channel, I like to offer you tips and strategies for making your relationships the best they can be and for healing your attachment style. Today, I'm focusing pretty big picture, though we'll have a couple nuances within each tip, for how to think about being a good partner in your relationship, to do your part in making it the best it can be. So number 1, and this is really the top tip, is to work on your stuff. And so this is maybe especially important if you think that you don't have stuff. Maybe you feel like you had a pretty healthy childhood and you don't really feel like you're as unhealthy maybe as some other people psychologically. Maybe you haven't done a lot of therapy, but you haven't really felt like you needed it. The important thing here is to realize that everyone has some stuff that comes up in relationship. And this is where the attachment style thing will creep in a little, my focus on that and on healing, because, you may have a secure attachment style, for example. Maybe that's true. But it's also true that sometimes people have secondary attachment styles or have little nuances or that they polarize in the relationship. So even with regard to attachment style, even if you're secure, it can be true that you could still have some stuff or that you might have particular leanings when you attach. Because it's such an important relationship. When we're in a relationship with someone else, they're taking that on that role of who we're attached to. So everything gets magnified. It's a little different from in our other relationships, because they're such an important person in our lives that way. And I've done another video on co-regulation and the importance of it. I was talking about it in relation to dismissive avoidance, but it's also true for all of us that we're all the time co-regulating with other people as well, but particularly with our primary attachment figure, who's usually our partner when we're an adult. And so realizing that we have this kind of influence on someone else, it's important, and realizing that everybody has things they're working on and particular issues, however big or small they seem, is really important because we all have areas where we can grow. And to do this, so the second part of this is what can you do about it? If you're not sure what that is, I would actually advise taking a look at any pain points or argument type things in the relationship. This is where a relationship can be really helpful in showing us where our stuff is, right? And so taking a look at that, and even if your partner seems unhealthier than you in various ways, maybe they're insecurely attached while you're secure, for example, it still presents an opportunity of growth for you. Where are you reactive? Where do you have pain points in relationships? And maybe it is also with other people, other friends, or places like that. Where are there times in your life that were really difficult? Maybe you didn't finish processing them. Maybe you didn't feel like it was, a full-on traumatic thing that happened, but you could have some stored emotions or processing that still needs to be done around those. All right, tip number 2 for being the best partner you can be in your relationship is to realize that your partner is different from yourself. This is something that my own attachment healing, learning about it first and then healing and then training, really taught me. It's really true in all kinds of other ways as well, but this is where I really saw it in action, which is that however much sometimes our partner, they're a person. They feel like we feel so close to them. We feel like in a lot of ways they do understand us deeply or have seen us deeply, particularly maybe when we got together. If you're in a pain point, that might feel less true at a particular time. But it's been true at some point that's like maybe why you got together in the first place. Maybe you also feel like you have some really shared similarities. You maybe you're the opposite attract type, but you could be the type where you feel like you're very similar to each other. But it's important to know that there's going to be ways that you're not. And that may sound obvious, but we really easily make assumptions from our own worldview. It's just kind of how our brains work. So understanding that our brains work that way, we might realize that we are making assumptions in all kinds of ways, from little to big, in our relationship. That can look like, the way we're communicating doesn't actually work for our partner. It can look like a partner seeing an issue in a completely different way than we are. And maybe we're having a clash over it, but we don't understand that the fundamental reason we're having the clash is actually because we're seeing it foundationally different. So if you're assuming that your partner's seeing it the same way right off the bat, then you're really off on the wrong foot for trying to solve the problem right from the beginning. So realizing everybody grows up in at least slightly different circumstances and has different experiences, and that means that we're all unique, trying to really fundamentally understand that. And so in any given situation, remembering that and saying, wait, are we seeing this the same way? Are we taking the communication the same way? How are they hearing what I'm communicating? If you can really take that stance, however close you feel to someone, however well you feel like they understand you or should understand you, that will go a long way in resolving conflicts in particular. Tip number 3 is to be mindful of love languages. So this gets into that kind of support that feels so wonderful in a relationship. That you as a partner can be providing this kind of fulfilling sense to the relationship and providing needs that could be practical, but could also be more emotional kinds of needs, for example, and feeling like your partner, if they want to feel like they're important, that they feel like they're important, and you're able to give that to them. Of course, some of that it's true. Sometimes I think that people who are very independent, or have learned to be independent, we can forget that this is true. Because we, of course, need to be giving all of this to ourselves. We need to be confident in ourselves. We can't be like expecting it from other people. So all of that's true at the same time. But that doesn't mean that relationships can't still be these beautiful things where we give to each other and we express and we lift up the other person, and we kind of, in a sense, fill them up. Not that they're empty to start, but we can also express our love that way. And so learning your partner's love languages is a fantastic way to understand the best ways that they will receive what you're trying to offer in your expression of love, and also the ways that they enjoy it best, because that's the whole point, right? It's this expression of your own love, but it's also this communication of it. So it's this two-way street. And just like with other communication, what you're saying or what you're providing is part of it, but also the receiving is really important as well. Otherwise, there's not that interaction and the connection between the two. So understanding that their love languages may be different from yours, and this is something you can just talk about and ask, like, what do they want? And, people feel seen even just to have people inquire about that. But it's important to understand that and do the best you can when you're feeling that expression of love and you want to give towards them, to go ahead and do it that way that they're going to really receive it well. And then one little extra tip I wanted to add about that is that it's really important to do that regularly too. So yes, it's important in general to do it, and to do it when you're just sort of really feeling it, but make it a practice. Make it a practice to fill your partner up in their own love language, way that works best for them, as an expression of your love. And that also goes a long way towards, if you've heard of the Gottman Institute, they really emphasize, because we will inevitably have some conflicts, putting in a lot of positives, so that because you need a lot more positives to actually outweigh the negative, because we have a negativity bias in just terms of how our brains work. So it's important to think of it that way. Like, you really want to be like expressing your love actively like that in a regular way, as a regular practice. All right, tip number 4 for being the best partner that you can be in your relationship is to be mindful of those tender spots. Who can hurt us better than the one who understands us the best? And so really trying to be careful with pushing buttons, really trying to be mindful of tender spots. I think sometimes we can go too hard towards something that's sensitive. And, maybe the person does need to work on a sensitive area. But think of it like in a gentle way, right? If we have a really tender spot, do we want like the spotlight shined right on it and like, let's just dig right in there? I mean, I don't think any of us necessarily want that. Like, there are times in our life when something comes to the fore and we just have to deal with it then and there. But it's important to be mindful of going gentle. That doesn't mean, not bringing up something at all. If it's a problem, it needs to be brought up. But just trying to be really mindful of those tender spots and use that understanding that you have of your partner. Maybe take some thought, put some thought into something before you're going to talk about an issue, realizing that there could be a tender spot there. And so that you can really think about your words and think about how you go into it, maybe expressing care ahead of time, for example. This comes up a lot when I'm talking about the different attachment styles and relating from them, because the core wounds come up a lot, right? So if you have an understanding of something, whether you're calling it a core wound or not, depending on how you've investigated it, you can actually communicate with someone realizing that that core wound is going to come up, and your conversation will both be gentler for that person and will actually be much more effective, because if a core wound or a tender spot is hit right at a time or in a way that doesn't feel as gentle, what's going to happen? The person's going to go reactive, the person's going to go defensive, they might get dysregulated. And so that doesn't really help with that communication or progressing it either. So kind of for two reasons there. One is just simply compassionate kindness to your partner, wanting to be mindful of their tender spots, and that's okay. Yes, you're their partner, but you don't have to dig in and have everything all out there. And the second part is that actual communications often go better if you're mindful of those tender spots and those core wounds. All right, tip number 5 for being the best partner you can be. I think this is, in a way, the hardest one, maybe with the exception of the first one where you're not really seeing that you have stuff yourself, is to be vulnerable. And some of this maybe is just clearer and you can just be brave and try to say, your real feelings in a situation, for example, and it might be obvious. Sometimes what's hard about this is that I think we don't always even know when we're being vulnerable or not. We maybe say the surface thing, the surface feeling a little bit, but we don't really go to that core. And I think the best way to try to tackle this is to really think about the emotions involved. So thinking about an I statement, for example, I have a video on that as well, because I didn't used to understand them. And I finally got it, that it really is this link to the vulnerability that's key. The reason we say, I felt, whatever it is, I felt sad when you, forgot me and you were supposed to pick me up or something like that. The reason we say that I'm sad isn't to say, see how you affected me, to the other person. It's to really let them see you. And so I think sometimes it's really easy to just say, maybe say I was like, let's say you'd say instead, I was frustrated when you didn't pick me up. But really, you're like having this huge other reaction where it's triggering your core wounds, for example. And you feel like, hey, everyone, it triggered your I will be abandoned wound. It triggered a betrayal wound. It triggered all these things. If you can try to look as deeply as possible into what's happening for you and actually share that, that's huge. And people really respond to that. I mean, that's why I statements are effective if they're used in that correct way, where you're realizing your own vulnerability is part of it. So see what you can do there. It's not always easy. Sometimes, we're suppressing or blocking it from ourselves. But just ask yourself that question. Like, am I frustrated in that particular case I was talking about? Or is this something more? What am I really feeling? Like, am I actually sad? What's going on here? And then just expressing that to your partner. Would be really helpful and would really help them to see you and understand you. And then they'll know your tender points, like I was talking about in that other tip, and they can be mindful of those as well. All right, tip number 6 for being the best partner you can be in your relationship is in how you listen and respond when someone tells you something, whether it's an I statement, whether it's some feedback they're giving you. Hopefully it's not sounding like criticism, because of course it's true that they have responsibility as well for how they're communicating to you. But trying to really listen to what they're saying deep down and trying to, because I think one of the problems here is that it's really easy to jump to your own intention. And if you feel like you're being misunderstood and that's not how you meant it at all, but if you can really try to listen to the other person first, knowing that you will eventually get your chance to tell your part of it too, that's really important, because the person will feel heard. That goes a long way towards diffusing a potential conflict that can happen. It can be really hard though, sometimes to, not be defensive. So if you do get into a situation where a core wound is activated, you're really defensive, you can try telling the person, hey, I'm feeling really reactive to this right now. And maybe add something like, but I really want to hear you out on it. So could you give me a few minutes? Something like that. That could be helpful. So communicating vulnerably about if you're reactive, I think actually can be helpful at the time. But other than that, trying not to, in terms of the actual content, trying not to be like debating it already before you fully heard it or that kind of thing. And it's also important to remember as you're taking it in that this is this person's experience, right? And so you may have your side to it that's perfectly valid and that they eventually do need to hear. But, just like I said with the communication, it's really a two-way street. What your intention was and what your behavior was, for example, may not have been the same. So you do want to consider that you may have a part to play that they are telling you about. All right, tip number 7, a little bit related in terms of communication and how you're taking it and where you're going with it when someone tries to tell you something. So tip number 7 to being the best partner that you can be is to try not to make it about yourself when someone shares something with you. And so I mean this in a slightly different way from the way I was just saying it, where you're trying not to immediately be defensive and can just hear them and hear what they're saying and take it in. In this case, I mean in the sense of the actual content and what it means for you. So let's say your partner shares that they are just feeling so overwhelmed at work and they need to reduce their hours, and they're paid hourly. And so you hear what they're saying. Maybe you're even, in the moment quickly processing, oh, that's too bad. I feel bad for you that you're overwhelmed. But you take it immediately to this next step of what it means for you. So in that case, maybe you say, oh my gosh, but finances, we can't afford to have you reduce your hours, right? You're jumping immediately to what it means for you in that case. So really try to take a breath and fully hear what they're saying first. Really try to hear that first. We can't always control that our mind is jumping to the other thing, but that doesn't mean we have to communicate that immediately. There will be time later for talking about what that means for finances. But try to really hear, that's something really vulnerable that your partner's sharing with you. So try to go into that space of the fact that, hey, this person is communicating this with me. It's probably hard to do. It's vulnerable. They're sharing this with me. I am entrusted with it. If you can think of it that way, actually with all of these tips, if you can think of it like I am entrusted in a way with this person's heart, with this person's vulnerability, I think that can help us to have that stance where we are putting them first if they're coming to us in a communication. And then knowing that eventually we can address other issues that are coming up because of what they're saying. Now, this can be especially hard, perhaps if you're anxious, if you have a lot of anxiety. And so, I think really practical tips can help here. We can't always just tell ourselves, oh, focus on them if we're not there. So really trying to use tips that might help, whatever tips help with your anxiety, for example, like trying to ground. So really trying to ground into the present moment, because that's going to be great for both reducing that anxiety in the moment and for being right there with your partner. So noticing sensory things around you. It could even be something about your partner you're noticing in a sensory way if you want to keep the focus on them. So noticing how their face looks right that moment, noticing how their eyes look as they're telling this to you could be really helpful. All right, that's what I've got for you for today. I'm sure there are plenty of other tips, and I'd love to hear them in the comments below. If you're enjoying this content, if you're finding it helpful, please like, share, and subscribe. I'm trying to get it out as widely as I can because I know we all can use tons of help with our relationships and with our attachment styles as we all try to move towards more fulfilling, healthier lives and relationships.